We've got about 20 people who've already arrived. I know there's quite a few more who registered for this training, so we may just allow for 1 or 2 more moments as people are popping on, and then Matt will kick us off. Welcome, everybody. Okay, welcome. So just a reminder that if you're calling in from the phone, you can follow along in the PDF of the PowerPoint that was sent to you over email. And if you're calling in through Zoom and you can see our screen, you'll see the opening slide and potentially the videos of those of us as panelists who are live from both the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance and Let's Grow Kids staff.
So should we get started, Anna?
Let's get started. And just to answer one of the first questions I see in the chat is just that all participants are muted right now and are not on video. So you should just be hearing us and seeing the screen, and there will be opportunities throughout this to participate through the chat and question and answer sections, and we'll have a little more details about that in a minute. So right. Matt, why don't you kick us off?
Great, so welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to have so many of you participating in the webinar. This is part of a series that Charlie Glisserman on our staff kicked off, and so she's your usual host. We have some other hosts this time. And so this is the last so far in a series, but we'll probably have more later in the spring. And the subject today, as you see from the slide, is getting back to advocacy, specifically about childcare and early education. So the webinar is being recorded so that other folks can view it later. And as Anna mentioned, there will be some interactive aspects later on. We encourage folks to use the chat function if they have any questions. And we have a lot of tech help available. People have questions about how to use the different aspects of the Zoom platform. So the co-host today, myself, I'm the executive director of the Alliance. Why don't we name people off? Anna, Jen, and Drake, and Charlie, go in that order. You can introduce yourselves.
Anna Gebhardt, field director for Let's Grow Kids.
Jen Horwitz, I'm the Policy and Research Director for Let's Grow Kids.
Morning, everyone. My name's Drake Turner, and I am the Policy Manager for Let's Grow Kids.
Good morning. This is Charlie Glisserman, Public Engagement Director with the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance. Thanks for joining us.
Great. So thanks so much again for participating. The agenda today is going to be a combination of trying to share some information with folks, but also have some interactive elements and allow for some question and answer at the end. So we're going to talk about the evolution and the transitions that have happened with our policy agenda because of the pandemic, go back to a little bit of review about where we were, and then trying to understand where we are now, both in terms of the response specifically to the pandemic, but also as we think about re-engaging on our advocacy agenda, because it is time to start to ask those questions that we were asking back in January and February. And that gets to this question of the third point on the agenda, taking action in the time of COVID-19. What does advocacy look like now? How do we do it? Spoiler alert, it isn't all that different than what we were doing before. But we're gonna give you some tips and some suggestions and allow time for a question and answer and some sharing, and then we'll wrap up at the end. Different folks will be speaking throughout amongst the different panelists. So we'll try to pass it around a little bit. And I think that's a basic overview of what we're planning to do. Again, if you have questions or if you need assistance, the chat function is a great way to go. You can also text any of the panelists. Charlie and Drake in particular are the technical people here, so you can text them if you have that capacity, and we'll do our best to help you get engaged. And again, this is going to be recorded, so the materials will be available afterwards. Jen, you want to go over some housekeeping for folks just so they know exactly how the Zoom platform works?
Sure. So as Matt was saying, there are a couple of different tools that we have this morning that we're going to try and make it a little bit interactive, make sure that you have the tech support that you need. So Charlie just posted her phone number that you can text her at. We also have the chat box. So that's something that's great. If you have technical assistance questions, you can send that to one of the panelists and Charlie or Drake will be able to help you with that. There's also this tool that shows up, it looks like two little word bubbles and it says Q&A underneath it. So if you're on the web platform, that's the best way. If you have questions about the content as we're talking through, you can literally ask a question in live time, and when we have breaks built in throughout the webinar to answer questions, you can make sure that you put your question into that Q&A tool, and that's the best way for us to see that. We're really trying to use the chat box for more conversation and dialogue, and it can be easy for questions to get lost in there. So if you put them into the Q&A tool, what we're going to do is have, as I was saying, have a couple of breaks where we check in, see what questions are coming through. And that Q&A tool also allows us to pull a report at the end of the webinar. That's the fun advantage of the Q&A tool. And then we can see, are there questions we didn't get a chance to answer? And it makes it really easy for us to then put together a list of questions we didn't have time to get to, make sure we can put some answers together for you. And we'll be sharing that as a resource for everyone after the webinar, in addition to the recording that Matt was talking about. So again, you have that chat function. That's a way for you to just kind of share conversational information, to ask for some technical assistance support. You can also text Charlie. And then that Q&A tool is really, if you have questions about what we're talking about, that's where you should put those questions during the conversation. We'll also have a couple of pop-up polls throughout the webinar, and you're literally able to just click on that poll and vote what your kind of option based on the available answers is, and then we'll all be able to see responses in live time together. So thanks for joining. And if you have any questions, again, you can message Drake or Charlie through the chat or text Charlie directly.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. So I get the pleasure of introducing you guys to each other, and we're going to actually use the chat function that Jen was just speaking about right now to practice using some of these tools. This is a really fun way for us to all interact, especially in a time when, you know, being together isn't possible, and it's actually makes it so much more accessible because we don't have to drive anywhere to be together. So let's have a little minute to hear from each other. And I'd love it if you could introduce yourself in the chat box by saying your name, what town you live in, and one thing that you're grateful for, and possibly your biggest concern related to childcare during this COVID-19 response period. So I see some introductions coming through. Laura already introduced herself, which is so great. We've got Emily Pryor here. Again, we won't be able to read all of these in live time, but it's fun. We can all watch them as they're popping up. And this gives us the ability to kind of assess who's here. And we will be coming back to these questions around, you know, one thing you're grateful for and one concern you have during this time. We'll be reflecting on these again at towards the end of this webinar. So it's a great time to start really feeling into and thinking through, you know, what you're experiencing right now. Great. There's Lisa and Stephanie and Lucy. Thank you guys for all calling in from all over the state. It's fun to see the towns popping up: Winooski, Dorset, Burlington, Nora Metz. Oh, Elo May. Welcome. Bradford. All right. Thank you guys. You're doing a great job with these tools. So now we're going to get into a little bit of an overview of some of the from some of the policy, and Jen is going to kick us off with that.
Thanks, Anna. So we're gonna, as Matt was saying, spend a little bit of time talking about where we started 2020 at, where we are now, and kind of what we're moving towards. So if you remember, once upon a time, it was January. Now it's May, and it feels like it was maybe 5 years ago that it was January. But not too long ago, we were starting the legislative session fresh. We had this legislative agenda related to early care and education. We were excited to take action. If you remember back to the Alliance's great graphic representation of all the different issues on the legislative agenda, there were a number related specifically to early care and education. So we're just going to take a minute to reflect back on that, think about what were we talking about a few months ago? Was that really this year? For me, it feels like it was a whole lifetime ago before all of this started. So back when we had that going on, we were focused on these three main categories. So one was sustaining and growing Vermont's early care and education workforce, so really supporting early childhood educators through a variety of ways. We were also working to make childcare more affordable and accessible for Vermont's children and their families. And we're also working to try to engage Vermont's employers to help strengthen and sustain our early care and education system. So specifically to those early childhood educator supports, we were looking at expanding scholarships through investment, ideally going into Vermont's Teach Early Childhood program. So really trying to make sure that program had enough to sustain the current participants, and also looking to expand some of the areas that it worked in, so including expansion up to a bachelor's degree program, which would be really great, and also being able to build in some more slots into the existing program. So that was kind of area number one. Area number two was looking at student loan repayment support for newer early childhood educators. So thinking about the fact that it was already challenging before everything that's going on with the pandemic response, wanting to make sure that we were really supporting new early childhood educators who were just coming into the field. A lot of times, I don't know about anybody else, I took out a lot of student loans to get through school, and being able to pay that plus what you're making as a new early childhood educator is really hard to balance those pieces. So how can we better support new folks in the field? And then also looking at developing a temporary wage support program. So this is a tool that's been used in other states, looking at the fact that there is a significant wage gap between early childhood educators and their peers in other fields. And so looking at what is that wage gap, what's a way that we can start working towards wage parity, and while we're doing that work, thinking about some kind of wage supplement program that's supported by the state to help make up a small but important percentage of that gap. So those were all the things we were talking about in terms of early childhood educator supports. And then in terms of making sure that childcare is affordable and accessible to families, looking at Vermont's childcare financial assistance program. So we have the market rate survey that kind of pulls together information and says what are programs actually charging families right now, and then the childcare financial assistance program's reimbursement rates, so how much childcare programs are paid, is supposed to reflect those rates. And unfortunately, because we have constrained resources, those rates are kind of fallen out of pace with what are the current costs of providing childcare. And so we were asking to bring some of those rates to align with the 2017 market rate survey findings, so that all of the different age groups, so we have infant rates, toddler rates, preschool, after school, so that we were trying to align all of those with the 2017 market rate survey findings. And then another really important piece, but not super easy or fun to talk about, is the fact that there is IT behind all the things. And I think Vermont has had an experience with IT as we go through all of this pandemic response in lots of different ways. But one thing that was really challenging before COVID-19 happened was that the IT system behind Vermont's Child Care Financial Assistance Program is outdated. The program can't continue to grow and expand the way that the Child Development Division would like, without really upgrading that IT system. So we're looking at how can we strengthen that IT system and make sure that it is something that works and helps the program continue to expand and grow as the needs of Vermont's child care programs and the children and families they serve continue to evolve and grow. And then the last category we were looking at in terms of engaging employers, there are a lot of different employers who want to support their employees in different ways in accessing childcare. So we were looking at creating a pilot program to try and help employers work with early care and education programs and other community partners to figure out how can we strengthen and sustain the early care and education programs in our community. So those were kind of the main areas we were all talking about just a few months ago as we entered 2020. And we're kind of starting to figure out how can we advocate this year in order to strengthen our system. So that's the really fast recap. Hopefully you remember some of those things and they're not just a big surprise to you and you've seen them in different ways. But what we're gonna do now is, since we talked through those, we're gonna talk through, if you can remember back with me a few weeks or months ago, lots of different people were engaging in advocacy in different ways. And so what we want to do is bring up our first poll and just get a sense of what people were thinking about in terms of how you were engaging with this legislative agenda before we kind of start to make the transition to the program closure. So think about January and February and like very early March. What were you already doing? Oh my gosh, yay! I love watching this thing in real time. So it looks like a lot of people were emailing their legislators, meeting with their legislators, and lots of people were planning to go to ECDL. So we'll give it just another second or two, and then I'll end that poll so we can continue on. So if you haven't voted yet, you can take a minute. Let us know how you're planning to take action. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. Thank you. And I'm going to share the results so you can all see. So lots of different ways that people were actively engaged in advocacy on these issues. And it looks like a lot of people were planning to go to ECDL. So we so appreciate that. And that was actually our next slide, is so many people were planning to go to ECDL, and we were excited about that and excited to mobilize with all of you. So thank you for everyone who's planning to be there. We really appreciate it. We're really sad that it had to be canceled too, but I think given where we are now with the pandemic response, it was the right decision to make. And you know, that was really the turning point in us thinking about our advocacy. As Matt said earlier, spoiler alert, some things really haven't changed that much, but then we had this collective moment where we all had to pause and think about, well, what do we do now? Which we had to do that because along came COVID-19. So a lot has happened in the past few weeks. I still can't believe it's May, and if you ask anyone at Let's Grow Kids, I perpetually think it's Tuesday. I don't know why, but I am always stuck on Tuesday. Apparently it's Tuesday every day. But it's brought a big shift to all of us. So not only did we had to cancel ECDL, but we've all had to kind of pivot and think about, well, what does this mean? How do we make all of this work? And everyone is having while we're all kind of going through this together, we all have very different experiences and feelings and challenges. Some childcare programs have had to close, some have opened or reopened in order to provide childcare to essential workers. Some families have had to figure out different ways to balance, how do I manage kiddos at home and working remotely, and kind of how do I make my day work? And, you know, all of us have had lots of different experiences in this time. And so what we're going to do now is really start to talk through. So we had this legislative agenda before, and then we all kind of had to pause and reshuffle, and things have been continuing to evolve and change since then. And we're going to talk through what has been the federal legislative response and the state legislative response specifically to early care and education through this time. And then we'll kind of talk about, so what's next. And we're really focusing here on policy pieces. So we're not going to get into detail about some programmatic supports in different ways. There are a lot of different resources available to help you with that through the Let's Grow Kids website, through the Alliance's website. Let's Grow Kids has a separate webinar series about technical assistance for early care and education programs, about how do I navigate like operating or not operating right now during COVID-19. So we're not going to get into those details. We're really going to stay focused on policy. But as we go along, Drake will throw in some resource links in the chat so that you have those for reference. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk through the federal pieces.
Right. And Jen just said it, and Drake just posted it in the chat bar, but let me just reiterate, as we go through these more technical issues, if you have questions, post them on the chat bar or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them. We're trying to go quickly because there's a lot of content, but if you have specific questions, put it in that Q&A section and we'll get there. So my job at this next point is to talk about the federal response. There have been 3 bills that have been passed. It's a little confusing and they all kind of mush together, and frankly, that's okay. They all have the same basic, well, actually, the first 2 were quite targeted, and the third one is the big one that has all the money in it that people are talking so much about. Those of us who are tracking this closely, the 1.25 billion with a B amount that came to the state, and that's the CARES Act. The first 2 bills were much more targeted. They help set the stage for the response. Right now, part of what the state is trying to do is figure out where to charge different programs in the different buckets. So even that might change over time as the guidance changes from the federal government. What's important is that I think a few things. One, so far we're doing very well in terms of drawing down federal money and not getting ahead of ourselves and not making mistakes. It may feel frustrating that decisions haven't been made, but the good news is that we're positioning ourselves to draw down as much of the federal funding as possible. The second thing to point out is that the big batch of money, the CARES Act funds, have some very specific limitations that are inhibiting the creativity that folks have about how to spend the money. The most important limitations for the CARES Act, that's that $1.25 billion. The most important limitations are that that funding has to go towards the emergency response. And it has to be for things that where the spending where the problem was created or occurred starting in March, and it has to end at the end of the calendar year. So it's really for one-time activities specific to emergency response. So you could, for instance, buy a computer system that you need for right now that, just happens to have a 20-year lifespan, but you shouldn't be starting a program of supporting something that you expect will go on and on and on into the future using this funding. And the other limitation that makes a difference for the bigger picture is that at this point, the money cannot be used to replace lost revenues on the part of the state. The underlying context for all this, which we'll get to when we talk about the other advocacy that we need to do about our pre-existing agenda, is that the state is in a very difficult position in terms of its budget because we lost all this tax revenue because of economic activity essentially ending. if the federal government changes the limitations and allows us to spend this $1.25 billion in part on replacing that revenue, the entire state's budget situation will be relaxed and there'll be much less panic about what to do about things. There's an expectation that that is what in fact will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So until then, there's a lot of waiting and watching on the part of folks in the legislature. There's a lot of collecting information, but a hesitation about making decisions. So that's where we are in this point of collecting information. That's one reason why this webinar today is so important in its timing, because now is when legislators want to know what the needs are so they can begin to figure out how to spend the money in the limitations that exist. So that's, again, a really quick overview. We do expect there to be more federal action in the coming weeks and months. And some of it will change this underlying situation so that in 2 months, we probably have a very different we might have a different report. So it's hard for us to say exactly what's going to happen, but we're doing our best to help you all engage the process as these things evolve. So Jen now is going to take it back and talk some more about the specific state policies that have been put into place and things that are being thought about going ahead.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt was saying, a lot of those federal dollars that are coming down through the really important pieces of federal legislation that have kind of created these appropriations to the state are flowing into Vermont in a couple of different ways. But some of that federal legislation also created space so that the state could use existing federal dollars coming down through different existing federal streams in kind of slightly different ways. So one of the first ways we wanted to talk about was with the Child Care Financial Assistance Program and our UPK, or Act 166 payments. So Child Care Financial Assistance Program comes down, a lot of its funding comes from a federal source called the CCDBG, the Child Care and Development Block Grant. And so there is this giant tome of a guidance manual that comes with that federal funding, and it has very specific rules and regulations about how can you use these dollars. But one of the things that one of those federal bills that you just saw on the last slide says is you are allowed to continue making those payments based on enrollment status instead of actual attendance. So Vermont right now is paying child care programs for children who were enrolled at the start of the closure that was ordered by the governor for child care programs not providing child care for essential workers. So that child care financial assistance program reimbursement payments can continue to be made based on that enrollment instead of actual attendance, since so very few kids are attending programs right now compared to before the pandemic response. So those payments are continuing thanks to some federal and state changes in how they're allowed to make those payments. Also, the universal pre-K payments are continuing to be made based on enrollment instead of attendance as well. So that's great news for early care and education programs. Another thing the state was able to do is recognize the fact that it's really important to sustain our early care and education system, both for early childhood educators and for kids and families during this time. So recognizing that a mandatory closure would have significant impacts on so many different people, they created the Child Care Stabilization Program. And while there are some challenges with the program, overall, the goal is to really help support our early care and education system through this time. We have lots of information available on the Let's Grow Kids website, more details about the program. The really quick recap is that the governor recognized that this is a really essential piece of sustaining Vermont, both for families and for our early education workforce. And so if we want to sustain those programs, how can we make sure that programs have the actual dollars to be able to pay their lease or their rent or their mortgage and their utilities? And how can families make sure that they still have a program and a slot to come back to as we work towards a place of economic recovery and reopening? And how can we support everyone through this process? So they created the Child Care Stabilization Program to really try to work towards that. And then there's also, as I was saying before, making sure that essential workers who are continually working through the pandemic response have a safe place for their kids to go during this time, and that there are still early care and education programs open so that kids can continue to receive really high quality, amazing childcare. I know that's really important time. I have a very close friend who's a doctor, and she has no idea, and her spouse also is in a field that's essential workers, and they have no idea what they would do without their amazing childcare program that has continued to be open to support them through this, because she has to go to work and work with patients during this time and doesn't know what she would do without her childcare. So those are kind of the three main areas that Vermont has really focused on in order to kind of support kids and families and to support our childcare field through this. And then, so those are kind of the policy, regulatory oriented pieces. And now Matt's going to talk more about the budget side of all of that and what's going on in Vermont.
Right. So we're now ready to move ahead and think about what next. And this is where the advocacy part really kicks in. So this can get pretty technical. And as those of you who've worked with us in the past know, we try to help you understand all these terms so that when you talk to legislators, you have the context and the grounding and can make requests that that are informed and really engage the legislators in a positive way. So a little bit of knowledge in this part really goes a long way to helping you get your voice be heard. So there are three different parts of the budget process that are being considered right now. There's going to be an adjustment to the current budget. This is current fiscal year budget. Those of you who watch this process closely know that there is always a Budget Adjustment Act, a BAA, that passes halfway through the fiscal year, which is January, February. But this year, because the budget is all messed up, they're going to have to do another budget adjustment. So starting this afternoon, the House Appropriations Committee is going to start talking about what to do about adjusting the current fiscal year budget. The plan at this point is to then do a budget for the first quarter of FY21, which starts in July. That's referred to as the skinny budget, because for a variety of reasons, we won't know how much revenue the state has to work with until July or August, which is 3 months later than usual. That's mostly because the federal government decided to delay the deadline for submitting your income taxes from April 15th to July 15th. So that means the state won't know how much money we've gotten until the fiscal year has already started, which means you can't really write a budget until you have that until that information is in. So the plan is to do the first quarter budget and then do a final budget for the rest of the fiscal year sometime in the late summer. We don't know yet what the skinny budget will look like. The current thinking is that it would be the equivalent of a continuing resolution that the federal government uses now all the time, which is to say that spending would just be sort of projected out from FY20 spending would just be sort of projected out into FY21. The other thing that's going on that I want to make sure we have time to stress, and I know that a lot of folks have talked about and have voiced concerns about, is the administration's response, the system's response, and the question of what is the governor's guidelines and directive, what are they going to look like in terms of reopening? And when it comes to advocacy, there's definitely a window, an avenue, a communications line that we would encourage everyone to use to help CDD write the guidance in a way that is going to work as best as possible for everyone. They have been working hard to try to connect with people. I know the communications, particularly on the stabilization program, were not perfect. Things changed, guidance was adjusted. It hasn't been ideal, but it seems like at this point, they're really making a good faith effort to try to communicate with the field when it comes to what should reopening look like. And so we want to make sure that you all have that in your awareness as well. And we want to help you connect with legislators and with the regulatory community. BBF has a tool to try to get information there. And CDD just opened a poll that is closing today that we want to talk about. So that's all part of this as well. Advocacy is both about the budget process and what spending should be allocated for, and also about writing regulations. So that's an overview of those two things. Jen, I think it's back to you to talk about messaging.
Thanks, Matt. So just to quickly recap, since we ran through where we started, kind of what's happening now. So what does this mean for what's next for policy? So as Matt was saying before, some things kind of have changed, but a lot of what we're talking about really hasn't changed. When we think and look at our legislative agenda right now, we're still looking at areas as this federal guidance comes in, as we know a little bit more about what resources we'll have to work with. Where we're seeing the legislative agenda start to shift to is really pretty similar to where we started the year. So we'll still be looking at different ways to support early childhood educators in Vermont. Still looking at things like wage supports and scholarships. We still want to make sure childcare is affordable and accessible in Vermont. So how can we strengthen CCFAP? And as we look at different options for that, we'll be really waiting to see what this additional federal guidance is about how those dollars can be used. As we said before, IT is really important. That might be a great opportunity for one-time funds to say, oh, well, we can just buy a new IT system with that. But there are other ways that, as Matt was saying, since those dollars kind of disappear at the end of the calendar year, that might not be good for making longer term investments that need to be sustained. So continuing to really evaluate that. So those are kind of the three areas we're looking at. As you may have noticed, that employer engagement piece has kind of fallen back a bit. You know, that was going to require some one-time funding, but probably isn't a good fit for the CARES Act dollars and other resources that are available right now. So that's something we'll continue to pay attention to. But right now that's kind of shifted backwards. And now there's more of an emphasis on what are these system supports that we can really focus on right now.
And
so
let me just jump back in. If this sounds confusing, it is. I mean, we're at a point right now where the legislature is trying to do 3 or 4 things simultaneously. They are trying to figure out how to spend the CARES money, the $1.25 billion, but they're also starting to write the FY21 budget, which is where all the stuff that is on the screen right now is talking about. So legislators are confused. We're confused. It's okay. That's one of the messages today. It's okay. Legislators know that we're going to start talking to them about these issues. So you don't have to be specific or certain about what bucket would fund this or that or the other. We'll get to that in the next 2 or 3 weeks. You'll get more messages from all of us about how that starts to untangle and where to go. The timing today is perfect because just on Friday, we got the word that the appropriations committees are going to start talking about these issues, and they're going to do it simultaneously. So yeah, it's all these things put together, and that's okay. It's important though that we start talking about it now. So that's one reason why we're glad that this webinar is scheduled for today.
Yeah. And actually, Matt, that reminds me, I completely forgot to discuss this before. As I was saying, like everything has kind of changed in certain ways for us and some things have stayed the same. For legislators, things have really changed in the sense that all of a sudden now they're meeting virtually via Zoom meetings, and then that gets live streamed. And Matt's going to talk in a little bit about, so how do you engage with all of that? But for legislators in doing their work, things have changed. You know, it's a different timeline than what we started with. At first, we were looking at this kind of January to May schedule, and now we're looking at January to sometime in the future schedule. And, you know, legislators are our community members too, and they're also juggling all kinds of things like, how do I be a part-time legislator, and how do I care for my family, and how do I balance these other needs that I now have? So things in certain ways, things are continuing to move forward as we would expect with the legislative process. But in other ways, the timeline looks very different. The way that it's happening looks a little bit different. So those are all new and different pieces that are fitting into our legislative agenda. So given all of that, we want to take a moment. I'm going to turn it over to Drake so we can pause and see if you do have some questions about anything we've talked about so far. You can use that Q&A tool, and we can take a quick question break.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining. We don't have too many questions yet, and I want to be mindful of time because I think it's really important that we have enough time to really get into what everyone can do. because we do have some things that are really important, some time sensitive asks for folks. One thing I do want to just spend a couple of minutes on is going over some of the responses that folks had to what they're grateful for and what they're concerned about. And thank you to all who were able to share your thoughts in the chat. Because a lot of what folks said was really similar to each other. There were a lot of themes that came up, so I just want to spend a couple of minutes going over that. A lot of folks are grateful for the same things. I think although we're all experiencing this in different ways, I think there's a lot of shared gratitude happening. So a lot of folks share that they're grateful for their health, for the health of their family, for the health of their children, for the weather. I don't know if it was as beautiful in all of Vermont as it was up in the Burlington area this weekend, but it was gorgeous and I think much needed. A lot of folks are grateful to have a job right now. And in that line, a lot of folks are really grateful for the work that's being done in Vermont and to just be a Vermonter right now. Not every state is taking the actions that Vermont is taking to support the childcare system and a lot of other really important sectors. So there's a lot of gratitude there. There are some folks who are grateful for the momentum that we're seeing for our issue. I think people are realizing now more than ever how important the early care and education system is. And there are a lot of folks who mentioned they're grateful for having time to connect, time to enjoy the little things again and to work on professional development and keep in touch with students and parents. And then for some of the concerns, again, these were really shared by many folks in the chat, but going through a lot of folks are concerned with the children in their programs, with learning losses, safety, any social, emotional, and mental health. You know, there's clearly a lot of concern out there for how this is going to affect our children now and in the future. A lot of folks are concerned about reopening. I know that that's a thing a lot of people are thinking about. How do we safely reopen childcare programs in Vermont? And there's a lot that's still uncertain about that. I think we'll definitely be talking more about this in the coming weeks. It's not the focus of today's webinar, but it is a critically important thing that we're able to do this in a really responsible and safe way. And that really, I think, highlights the importance of filling out that CDD survey, which closes today, which Anna's going to talk about a little bit. Yeah, so I think I will hold the rest of the questions until the end for the final Q&A, unless there's anything else that folks want to share right now. But thanks so much.
Awesome, thanks, Drake. And for those of you who may be meeting Drake for the first time on this webinar, Drake is a staff member at Let's Grow Kids and worked really closely in the State House in January and February and is continuing to monitor committee hearings and meetings throughout this sort of online legislative session. And Drake's here really for all of you, especially to help bring the voices of childcare providers and parents and the general public to the legislators and supporting you with those systems, which used to look like driving to Montpelier and walking into the State House. But we'll talk a little bit more about what that can look like now. So as we look into next steps, it's really clear that, as Jen was saying, all the things we needed before are still and maybe even more obviously important now, you know, and I appreciated, Drake, that you read through some of those gratitudes. I think that there is momentum being built in this time because childcare and early education is clearly essential. And the work that early educators are doing is clearly essential. So we're going to talk through some specific actions you can take, but while we're still on this slide, Matt, do you want to talk a little bit more about how advocacy looks different right now and what the legislators, you know, are sort of up to and how people can engage?
Sure. And again, I'll try to be brief given the time. In a lot of ways, things are very similar to the way they were before, in that not everyone, in fact, very few people get to the State House, but people have an opportunity to connect with their legislators, and most of those connections still work. It can take a little bit more time, and you might have to be a little more persistent, but legislators are definitely responding to phone calls and emails and texts. Increasingly, as people get out a little bit, you may see people out and about. And I have found that legislators really do want the input and do want to hear from people. I think in general, what you want to think about, and I want to be sensitive to the fact that people are expressing concern about about the reopening process and the regulatory process, this is the time to think about who you have relationships with that will listen to you and reach out to them. It's not necessarily the greatest time to to start a relationship with someone. I mean, legislators are getting lots and lots of emails, and so they are humans and they tend to respond to the contacts from people that they already know. But I'm sure that many folks who are providers know their licensor, have long-term relationships with other providers, people who maybe it's folks who are LGK staff or BBF staff or other places who are sort of farther into the center. I don't want to say higher up the food chain, but sort of closer to the center of some of these discussions. If you have concerns, particularly someone mentioned about timing or other aspects of what's going on, you should voice those concerns. Find a time that you can be tactful and try to be concise, but let people know that you have concerns. Let people know what your thoughts are. Let people know what you're grateful for too, and keep communicating. That I think is the most important thing right now, is keep communicating with people. That's the one message that we want you to take away from all this, because even though things are different in terms of the legislative process, it's extended, it's virtual, the core components of it for advocacy remain. The legislators want to hear from you, and now is the time to reach out to them.
Great, thank you so much. And you know, this is really important to note, because actually at Let's Grow Kids, we have been really taking to heart and working to incorporate what we're hearing from providers and from parents in our advocacy. And the administration and legislators are reaching out directly to us to get input on how to best create policies moving forward. And that's all really due to the incredible advocacy all of you have already been doing over the last however many years. Like, we've really built momentum to this point that the legislature knows how that they can reach out to those that they have relationships with to get the most accurate information on how policies will affect children and families. And that's due to all the work that you've done to date. So I do want to take some time to just thank you all for your advocacy, the advocacy you've already done. So right now, like I was saying, we've had opportunities to actually be part of testimony. So just last week, Allie Richards, Let's Grow Kids CEO, did testify to the House Education Committee. And all of those are happening now over Zoom and broadcasted live on Facebook, but on YouTube. And then they're also recorded, and you can watch those and you can find them on the Vermont Legislature's website. When you look up those committees, you can find direct links to watch those. So if you'd like to see the kinds of things that are being testified, you can actually witness that yourself in your own free time, or find out the schedules and join and watch as the conversations happen live.
And later this week, Charlie's going to be putting up on our website the Virtual Advocacy 101 webinar, which we did just a little while ago, which goes over a little bit about how to find these things and how to access them.
Right.
It's sort of good news, bad news. The good news is anyone can watch a hearing. The bad news is if you have insomnia at 3 a.m., you can watch the House. I mean, you know, it's great, but it also, for those of you who are trying to manage your time, it means you can always squeeze another hearing in. So for those of us who really watch these, but yes, they're all available, and we can help you find them if you are not sure how to get a hold of where they are.
That's great. And there's been a lot of information in this webinar, and this will also be recorded and accessible afterwards. And so just to get everything in our last few minutes here. So there's some specific actions you can take right now. The most important action you can take is to take the CDD survey. This is the way to bring your voice to the table as the decisions get made in the reopening process. And I believe that survey is closing today. So Drake did put the link to it in the chat. It's also, been publicized in several different places. So please be sure to do that if you haven't yet. The second thing you can do is you can write your legislators an email. Like Matt said, this is a great time to continue to work those relationships that you've been establishing with legislators, and as well as other parts of the administration and your local decision makers. So you can use the Let's Grow Kids legislator dashboard if you don't already have your legislators' email addresses. And right now, the most appropriate thing you can do to continue to build that relationship is actually to say thank you, to voice some of those gratitudes that you voiced in our chat box, to really let legislators know. And I also took some notes as I was reading the chats, that you are so grateful for the supports from the legislature for the Child Care Stabilization Program. You're so grateful for the work that's been done on behalf of Vermont's children, and that you've had this time to continue to work remotely and connect with families, as well as to have this time to continue your professional development. Those were some of the gratitudes that I saw in the chat box that I wrote down. And then be able to then pivot to saying, you know, please keep me in mind as a resource as we continue to work to make the child care program in Vermont sustainable, and that, you know, you can remind them that we'll need continued investment in order to meet the diverse needs of children. And this is where you can kind of, in a very, you know, tactful way, slip in some of those concerns, right? To be able to say that, you know, we want what's best for children's social and emotional development. It's been really hard in this time of distance, and we hope to have all the supports we need to, you know, sustain children's education and their social emotional development into the future. So this is a great time to really say thank you, and to develop that place to say, I'm a resource and I'm here for you as we work to create sustainable investments in the early childhood system into the future. And that will set the stage for when we have a very specific ask and you're able to reach back out with those specifics. So I'm just trying to look here. I think we're going to shift to do another poll so we can make some specific commitments about what actions you are willing to take right now. So we see the poll should be popping up. So let us know, you know, fill out the CDD poll today. I think you could probably also check that off if you've already filled it out. Use the Let's Grow Kids legislator dashboard to thank my legislators. Let us know if you're gonna commit to that action. You can also thank Governor Scott and the administration. That's really important. They've made a significant commitment to sustaining childcare in this time. And then also engaging your community in advocacy. So remember that this is a great time when other people have these same gratitudes and concerns, to encourage them to use the dashboard, encourage them to join as a member of the Alliance to stay up to date. This is a great time to bring more people in to our advocacy efforts and continue to build momentum.
It's also a great time to say, to get to that last point, to say to one of your colleagues, you know, we should really talk to someone about this. Who should we talk to? Talking to each other, but it may be saying, going to your BBF regional coordinator and saying, can I just at least share this with you? Because we promise you, on a weekly basis, on a regular basis, those regional coordinators talk to each other. They have staff meetings. That goes to the BBF central staff. They then communicate it to their partners. It may be one of your mentors from some of your supports that you had, a professor that you've had, or someone, a teacher. I mean, get the information flowing. Find ways to share that information around. It really is making a difference right now. And the more that people can say, I should say something to someone, and find someone to say it to, that's what gets this momentum going and keeps it going. So we really encourage you to do that.
Mm-hmm. And Let's Grow Kids will be hosting community conversations on Wednesday that people can participate in, and that will translate into action teams across the state. So there's lots of ways for people to get involved. And there's our poll. Incredible. We've got some serious action takers here on this webinar. Thanks, everybody. All right, so I want to leave a little bit of space for any last questions we might have, so we can use the last 5 minutes to answer some questions from all of you.
Great, thanks everyone. And if anyone has any questions that are coming up right now, please feel free to keep asking them to us either in the chat or the Q&A. I know sometimes those Q&A features can be a little difficult to navigate, so it's fine to use the chat. There was one question that came up in the chat about whether or not the committee hearings that are broadcast on YouTube have transcripts, because I know it can be a lot to sit down and watch a 2-hour YouTube video, which some of us are doing and are happy to do. But that isn't necessarily something that all folks are able to do. So transcripts, as far as I'm aware, are not available. One thing that I do want to mention, though, is that there are a lot of us, presenting in this webinar today who are watching and taking notes on those calls and providing updates. So we, Let's Grow Kids, on our coronavirus resources page, we have a legislative update that Jen actually compiles each week that goes through different federal pieces of legislation, what's happening in the virtual state house, I guess you could call it. So there are ways that you can get information without having to actually watch those full videos. And if there's anything that you're interested in, Charlie wrote it in the chat, but you can always reach out to one of us if you want more information on what's been discussed. And I think we want to find ways to let folks know when there's really important hearings happening and engage with you that way, but there are no transcripts, unfortunately. So I do have a question that could be for anyone, but we've talked a lot about how to engage with the legislature, which is obviously very important. But does anyone have anything that they want to share on the importance of engaging with our state partners at CDD, for example, and the role that they play, aside from just this CDD survey, which is really important, but may not have every single question that folks are wanting to answer or provide an opportunity for folks to give all of the feedback that they want to give to the state.
As I said, I think it's really important. It can be hard. Everyone can't call the deputy commissioner and say, hey, Stephen, here are my thoughts. On the other hand, he's very receptive and he actually does answer emails from people. So I do think the licensors and other folks who you talk with on a regular basis are good people to contact. And there is definitely an active culture in CDD of collecting the feedback from the community and feeding back into the process. Doesn't mean we're going to get all of our questions answered or that all the answers are going to be satisfying, but it does seem like a good faith effort to try to collect information in that way. I think that's the best way to answer that right now. I don't know, Jen, if you have more to say on their process internally.
No, I think that's a really good suggestion because your licensor is who you have that relationship with. And as Matt was saying, like now is the time to leverage those relationships. And also as you are sharing thoughts, again, just as a reminder, a lot of state agency staff who are working during this time are working really hard and have been trying to make sure that people are supported as possible. So there's a chance your licensor may not be as responsive as normal. People are also working remotely and balancing lots of things, and that response time might look a little bit differently. So reach out to the folks that you have those relationships with, but also know that their life may look a little bit different too right now. So that response time might be a little bit different as well.
I also know that there's been collective responses. I've seen the one from Chittenden County and the one from Madison County. A lot of work done at compiling long, very solid letters that have a lot of content, a lot of solid information in them. So there are collective responses that are happening in different parts of the state. For those of you in other parts of the state, you may think about going through your BBF regional coordinator, or it's not called Starting Points Network anymore. What's it called now? I forgot the new name. But there are networks of folks who can get together and write a collective letter and even sign off, just borrow other people's letters from other regions and send them in as well. So there's a lot of potential for collective activity that you could include.
Thanks, Matt. I wanted to just use our last minute to also just say, while we're all having really different experiences, we are all also just trying to get through this. And one of the most important things is just to see everybody here on this call, including, our additional staff, our field managers at Let's Grow Kids and our programs team at Let's Grow Kids in addition. We're also resources for you. And so using our legislator dashboard is a great way to make sure that we can feel the collective impact by being able to track how many thank yous legislators are getting. So if you have a personal relationship and you're reaching out to your legislators by text or by a personal email, also let us know. Reach out to us and let us know that you're reaching out to them. It's been great to see some of those collective letters come through, and I'm so grateful that people do see us as a resource. So you can keep us in the loop as to how you're contacting legislators and keep us in the loop as to what they're saying back to you. And that way we can make an even stronger collective impact when we're called upon to give input to the legislatures. So we're 1 minute over, but you guys are incredible, and just stay in the loop, and we'll keep you up to date as things continue to change rapidly, and you're all doing incredible work.
Thanks so much to everyone. And if there are other topics that you want to know more about, just give us a shout, drop an email to Charlie, send her a text, and we'll do our best to set up more webinars. I know LGK has a series that they're doing as well. So we'll do our best to try to get you the information that you need as things evolve and continue to develop in the coming weeks. Thanks everyone for participating. Really appreciate your participation.
Bye.
Thank you all.